this happened just a few months ago. I live alone in a house in what I would describe as an average neighborhood. One night, I was by myself, relaxing and watching TV in the living room. It was around 11 p.m. when I heard my phone vibrate, the distinct vibration I get when receiving a text. Curious, I picked up my phone to see who it was. The message was from an unknown number, and it simply read, "Hey, I'm outside." Right away, I figured this was a wrong number. It seemed too random, so I didn't bother replying. I tossed my phone aside, thinking nothing more of it. About 10 minutes later, something caught my attention out of the corner of my eye. My living room is at the front left side of the house, with a window that looks out to the side. There's also a row of bushes just outside the window. I thought I saw someone walking past it. It was just a split second, and I couldn't make out any details because it was dark and the person was far off. I started to get a little uneasy, especially since I had just gotten that strange text. Could it actually be someone outside my house? I brushed it off at first, but the thought lingered. Feeling unsettled, I texted the number back, asking, "Who is this?" The response came quickly, "Come outside and see." My heart skipped a beat. Was there actually someone out there? I stood up, walked over to the front window, and peeked out. The front yard looked completely empty. I shut the shades and began checking every window in the house, moving from side to side, back to front. But I didn't see anyone. Just as I returned to the living room, there was a sudden knock on one of the back windows. My stomach dropped. I cautiously moved to the dining room, which faced the backyard, and peered outside. No one was there. At this point, I was genuinely freaked out. I texted back, "Why are you at my house?" Again, they responded immediately, "Come outside and I'll show you." Or do I have to break in? That's when I knew this was serious. I didn't waste any more time and called the police. I told the 911 operator that someone was threatening to break into my house, and I believed they were on my property. The operator assured me officers would be on the way. I hung up and just hoped the person wouldn't actually try to get in. For the next few minutes, I didn't receive any more texts. I thought about texting them again, but something told me it was better not to. Thankfully, only about 5 minutes later, the police arrived. I saw the flashing lights outside and went out to meet them. They searched around my house and the surrounding property, but they didn't find anyone. As the officers were still there, my phone buzzed with another text, "I can see the police there, LOL." I showed it to the officers, and they searched the area more thoroughly. They even looked around the nearby streets, but came up empty-handed. After about 20 more minutes of looking, the police had no luck finding anyone, and they eventually left. Although I felt safer with the police there, the whole situation left me creeped out. Luckily, I never received any more texts after that, and there were no further signs of anyone lurking around my house. Looking back, I still have no idea who it was. Sometimes, I think it could have been a neighbor playing a twisted prank, but that seems far-fetched. Either way, I'll never forget how terrifying that night was. One night, I was working in a random hallway, cleaning the floors. It was probably about midnight or 1 a.m. I remember that I thought I heard footsteps coming from not that far away. I looked over, but saw nothing. The footsteps might not have been in my sight, they could have come from around the corner. Curious, I walked over, wondering who could be there. As far as I knew, I was all by myself, as usual. When I made it to the end of the hallway, I looked around but still saw nothing. Shrugging it off, I went back to where I had been working and continued, thinking maybe I had just imagined it. After all, it hadn't been very loud, just faint sounds of movement. However, probably 10 minutes later, I heard the footsteps again. This time, I was sure I was hearing something. I looked towards the end of the hallway, and there, I saw a man walking by. I only saw him for a couple of seconds because he passed by quickly, moving from one hallway to another. He was only visible for a short amount of time, but I could tell it was a man. He seemed like an adult, but beyond that, I couldn't make out many details. He was too far away, and the lighting wasn't great. My first instinct was to start walking over and call out, asking who was there. Nobody was supposed to be in the school at this time, so it was strange. But no one answered me. When I got to the end of the hallway and looked around, the man was gone. There were other hallways he could have turned down, and I didn't hear anything. I walked a little farther, still calling out to see if anyone would respond, but there was nothing, just silence. After a bit of searching, I gave up and went back to work, chalking it up to perhaps some late visitor or maintenance worker I wasn't aware of. For a while, nothing happened. I continued with my cleaning routine and moved into another hallway after a few hours. But probably 3 hours later, something else happened that startled me even more. I was facing the end of a long hallway, focused on my work, when I suddenly heard a noise from behind me. It was a strange sound, one I couldn't immediately identify. I turned around to look, and what I saw made my heart skip a beat. A basketball was rolling down the hallway, right towards me. The ball rolled past me and hit a locker with a soft thud. I stared in the direction it had come from, and yet again, there was no one there. I suspected that whoever was in the building had stood at the far end of the hallway, rolled the ball in my direction, and then vanished out of sight. But why? What was the point of this? Were they trying to scare me? Play a prank? I picked up the ball and cautiously walked to the end of the hallway, calling out once more, "Is anyone there?" Still, there was no answer. It was dead silent. I stood there, staring down the hallway, listening for any noise, but nothing came. It was eerie. I stood like that for several minutes, just waiting, half expecting the man to reappear or make a noise to reveal himself, but it was as though he had vanished completely. I decided to go back to work, trying to shake off the strange feelings and get on with the rest of my shift. For the remainder of the night, I wasn't bothered again. There were no more footsteps, no more rolling basketballs, and no sign of anyone else in the building. As my shift came to an end, just before 5 a.m., I felt a strong urge to search the entire school one last time. I didn't want to leave without at least trying to figure out what had happened. So, I made my way through every wing and hallway, checking each one and calling out. I even looked in the bathrooms. Still, I found no one, and nobody answered me. When 5 a.m. hit, another janitor arrived to begin his shift. I told him about the strange occurrences, about seeing the man and the rolling basketball. He seemed a little confused but said he would keep an eye out for anything unusual. After that, I left the school and drove home, relieved the shift was over. I lived in a small house, just about 10 minutes away from the school. When I got home, it was still dark, and my usual routine was to go straight to bed and get some sleep. That day was no different, and I was tired from the weirdness of the night. But as I was in the kitchen, maybe 5 minutes after getting home, I heard a knock on my front door. Instantly, I was confused. Who could possibly be knocking at this hour? I walked over to the living room and peeked out the front window, but I didn't see anyone. However, just off in the distance, I caught a glimpse of a man walking down the street. He was only in my sight for a second or two before disappearing behind some trees, but in that brief moment, I was sure it was the same man I had seen inside the school. A chill went down my spine. I didn't know what to think. Had this man followed me from the school? Was he the same person? And why was he knocking on my door? I couldn't sleep after that. I stayed awake for hours, alert and on edge, but thankfully, the man never returned. After that day, nothing similar happened in the school again either. Still, I often wonder who that man was, what he wanted, and why he seemed to be following me. Last spring, on a day that felt almost too perfect, I went for a walk after work, as I often did. My job kept me confined to a desk, staring at a computer screen for hours, so getting outside was my daily escape. The park, just a couple of blocks from my apartment, was my usual destination, a place where I could clear my head and shake off the workday. I had been doing this for so long, it had become routine. The walk, the fresh air, the people in the park, it all felt so normal. But that day wasn't normal. The weather was warm and inviting, so I wandered a little farther than usual. I meandered through a few side streets, the sun still hanging low in the sky, before eventually circling back toward the park. People were out in droves, walking their dogs, jogging, or just enjoying the evening air. The streets had the buzz of spring, the energy where everything seems alive. I barely noticed the time passing. It was on my way back, just 5 blocks from my apartment, when something strange happened. I felt a tap on my shoulder. Turning around, I found a tall, thin man standing behind me. He looked about my age, casual and calm, but his words sent a shiver down my spine. "Hey," he said, his voice low and concerned. "I don't know if you've noticed, but someone's been following you for the last 20 minutes. My heart skipped. I hadn't noticed anything unusual. I had been completely absorbed in my own world, thinking about nothing in particular. "Who?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but feeling my pulse quicken. The man pointed back down the street, into the fading light. "He just walked away, but he was watching you, following you, for quite a while. Short guy, dark brown hair, wearing a white shirt." My stomach twisted. I didn't recognize the description. Had someone really been trailing me that whole time? Why hadn't I noticed? I scanned the area nervously, but the street was empty now, quiet. "Do you know where he went?" I asked, feeling a sudden urge to run home, to lock my door, to escape this strange moment. The man shook his head. He just turned and walked the other way. "I thought you should know." I thanked him, a little unsettled but not wanting to overreact. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe the guy was just going the same way as me. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As I walked the rest of the way home, I kept looking over my shoulder. Every rustling leaf, every shadow seemed more sinister than before. But there was no one there. By the time I reached my apartment, the feeling of being followed had faded, but an eerie sense of unease lingered. That night, even inside my apartment, I couldn't relax. Who was that guy? Why had he followed me? What did he want? I told myself it was nothing, that it was just a weird coincidence, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I decided to skip my usual walk the next day. Maybe it was paranoia, or maybe I just needed a break. Either way, I didn't want to take any chances. But the next night, something else happened. It was around 10 p.m., and I was moving from my kitchen to my living room when I saw it, a shadowy figure right outside my window, moving away into the darkness. I froze. Someone had been there, standing just outside, inches from my window, watching me. My apartment, being on the ground floor, had a small patio, but there wasn't much space between the glass and the fence. Whoever it was had been standing close, too close. My first thought flashed back to the man from the park. Was it the same person? Had he found out where I lived? I rushed to the window, but by the time I got there, whoever it was had vanished into the night. I didn't sleep well that night. Every creak of the building, every distant sound made my skin crawl. I kept checking the window, half expecting to see a face peering back at me from the darkness. But nothing happened. For a couple of days, things were quiet. I tried to convince myself that I had overreacted. Maybe it was just a random person passing by. Maybe there was no connection to the man from the park. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. 2 nights later, it happened again. It was even later this time, around 11 p.m., and I was sitting on my couch, mindlessly scrolling through my laptop, when I caught something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow. I barely had time to react before I saw it again, moving toward the window. Someone was out there. My heart raced, but this time I didn't freeze. I reached over and flicked on the patio light. The bright light flooded the space outside, revealing the man in full view. And that's when my blood ran cold. It was the same tall, thin man who had warned me about the stranger in the park. The same man. He had found me. Our eyes locked for a split second before he turned and bolted, disappearing into the night as quickly as he had appeared. I didn't chase him. I couldn't move. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. Why was he here? Why had he followed me again? Was he the one behind everything? I spent the rest of the night wide awake, my thoughts swirling. Every sound outside my window felt like a threat. Every movement, a sign that he was coming back. But he didn't return. Not that night. Days passed, but the fear didn't leave. I kept expecting him to show up again, watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment. It had started so innocently, with a walk in the park on a sunny day. Now, my life felt like it had been turned upside down, every night filled with dread, every moment tainted by the fear of his return. And still, I don't know why. I don't know what he wanted, or what he's waiting for. I remember when I was a kid, Toys R Us was my favorite place to be. The sheer size of the store, filled with colorful displays and endless aisles of toys, was nothing short of magical. I wouldn't get to go there often, but when I did, it felt like stepping into a wonderland. I vividly recall one particular visit when I was about 10 years old, right before my sister's birthday. My mother took me to the store to pick out gifts for her. Excited, I tagged along, though my interest lay in the action figures and video games rather than the girls' section where my mother was headed. I wandered off, convinced I could explore just a few aisles over. It wasn't long before I found myself in the Lego aisle, captivated by the elaborate displays. I reached out to touch a few figures when suddenly, I felt a strong grip on my arm. Startled, I turned to see a man with grayish hair wearing a blue jacket, an employee tag hanging from his neck. He told me I was in big trouble for touching the display. Confused, I apologized and explained that my mother was just a few aisles over. Instead of walking me back, he pulled me toward the front of the store, gripping my arm tightly. Panic surged through me. I hadn't broken anything, so why was this happening? As we passed the registers and headed toward the exit, dread settled in my stomach. It suddenly struck me that he didn't look like a real employee at all. My heart raced. Just then, I noticed a car parked a few rows over with a mother and child getting out. In a desperate attempt for help, I waved at the kid. The moment the man noticed, he loosened his grip slightly and began to push me instead, trying to lead me to his car. Seizing the opportunity, I broke free and sprinted back toward the store. The adrenaline coursed through me as I glanced back and saw him start to chase me. I had the upper hand, my small legs moving fast. I crossed the threshold back into the store, a wave of relief crashing over me as I spotted my mother near the front end, concern etched on her face. I quickly recounted what had happened, and soon, the police arrived. I had no idea then just how close I had come to a terrifying fate. Fast forward several years, I was now in high school, and my sister and I were home alone one Friday night. Our parents had gone out with friends, and we planned to indulge in our favorite pizza from a local place. I picked up the phone and dialed the number. However, in my nervousness, I mistakenly dialed the wrong number. A man's voice answered, sounding slightly confused. "Hello?" he asked. I nervously told him I wanted to order a large pepperoni pizza. He took my address, but something felt off. After hanging up, my sister and I settled in to watch TV, our money for the pizza waiting on the counter. 20 minutes later, my hunger peaked. I glanced out the window and saw a car creeping down our street. It came to a stop in front of our house, and I told my sister the pizza had arrived. She rushed to grab the money, but as I watched, I noticed the car didn't have the usual pizza delivery sign on top. Instead, it parked a little further down the road. A chill ran down my spine as I saw a man step out of the car, walking towards our front door. My heart dropped when I noticed he was wearing a ski mask. I turned to my sister, and we both ducked down, hearts pounding. Moments later, there was a knock at the door. "I'm the pizza guy." "I've got your pizza," his voice echoed through the house. A shiver ran through me. This was not a pizza delivery. After a few agonizing minutes, the man knocked again, louder this time, insisting he was with our order. We remained silent, crouched low, fear binding us in place. Then we heard him walk away, the sound of his footsteps fading into the night. I dared to peek out the window, and relief washed over me as I saw him get back into his car and drive away. I rushed back to my sister, and we decided to call the pizza place again, finally reaching them to place our order correctly. Later, as we enjoyed our pizza, we discussed the bizarre encounter. Who was that man? What would have happened if we had opened the door? The terror of that night haunted me, reminding me of the Toys R Us incident. It struck me that sometimes, the danger doesn't wear a mask, it hides behind a friendly face, a playful grin, or even a pizza delivery box. Both experiences left me with a chilling realization: childhood innocence can be shattered in an instant, and the world, though filled with joy, can harbor lurking shadows. It was just another day at the mall. The afternoon buzzed with chatter and laughter as families strolled by, but my store was oddly quiet. As the only employee, I was surrounded by shelves of merchandise, each minute ticking by in an anxious blur. The vibrant colors of toys and gadgets faded into the background as I struggled to shake the feeling of unease that had settled in. Then, he walked through the door. The man was short and thin, clad in a gray shirt that hung loosely off his gaunt frame and black pants that appeared to be several sizes too big. His hair was a messy tangle, and the unmistakable scent of smoke and cigarettes wafted off him, setting my nerves on edge. As he approached the counter where I stood, a chill ran down my spine. "I've been watching you," he said, his voice low and unsettling. My stomach twisted in knots. "I think you're beautiful." My mind raced as I processed his words, dread filling the air around me. I managed a weak smile, trying to brush off the unsettling nature of his compliment. "Thanks," I replied, forcing cheerfulness into my tone, but when he suggested I leave with him, panic surged through me. "No, thank you," I said, trying to sound polite, gesturing toward the door with feigned confidence. His eyes lingered on me, calculating. I could feel my heartbeat quicken as he stepped back, lingering in the doorway before he finally left. But the sense of relief was short-lived. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Less than an hour later, he reappeared, walking by the storefront and slowing down to peer inside again. The first pangs of fear began to gnaw at me. I thought perhaps it was a coincidence, but as he circled back a third time, I felt the weight of dread settling heavily on my shoulders. Each time he returned, he drew a little closer, his presence becoming increasingly suffocating. I could barely focus on the few customers trickling in and out. My mind was racing with thoughts of his intent. When my shift finally ended, I stepped outside into the bright afternoon, desperately hoping to escape the unsettling encounter. The mall was bustling, and I felt a false sense of security in the throngs of shoppers. As I made my way to the parking garage, I glanced back, and my heart plummeted. He was there again, lingering in the shadows, his eyes fixed on me. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. With each step, I could feel his gaze like a weight pressing against my back. I quickened my pace, darting through the crowd, checking behind me every few seconds. He was still there, trailing me, growing closer. Panic bubbled within me as I turned down a less familiar corridor of the mall, hoping to lose him among the maze of shops and shoppers. But he followed, his shadow ever present, a dark figure in my periphery. I felt the urge to call out for help, but the thought of drawing attention to myself paralyzed me. I needed to find a mall security guard. But where were they? In this busy mall, surely someone must be watching. I tried to scan the area, but each moment I spent searching only increased my anxiety. As I entered a larger store, I caught sight of him slipping inside just moments after me. My stomach dropped. I needed to escape, but every turn seemed to lead me closer to him. I raced through the aisles, heart pounding as I ducked and weaved past shelves, hoping to lose him. The store felt like a labyrinth, each turn potentially leading to my freedom or my doom. Finally, I burst back outside, my breath coming in quick gasps. My heart raced as I navigated the main hallway, desperately searching for an exit. But then I spotted the parking garage entrance and sprinted toward it. The dim light felt both welcoming and menacing as I entered, my body trembling with adrenaline. Just as I reached my car, I froze. There he was again, not far away, standing in the shadows, his eyes still locked on me. My heart raced, and I could feel the cold grip of fear wrapping around my throat. He hadn't noticed me yet, but I felt the dread wash over me like a tidal wave. I quickly pivoted, walking briskly in the opposite direction, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to make it to my car, to safety. I kept my eyes on the ground, willing myself to stay calm, but every instinct screamed at me to run. My footsteps echoed in the eerie silence of the garage as I made a beeline for my vehicle. Suddenly, I glanced back, my instincts flaring. He was still there, standing among the shadows, his gaze intent. I leaped into my car, slammed the door shut, and started the engine, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. My heart raced as I pulled out, every nerve ending on high alert. As I backed out, I dared a look in the rearview mirror. He stood there, still, a shadow against the harsh fluorescent lights of the garage. I sped off, relief flooding through me as I left the mall behind, but that sense of security was fleeting. For the next few days, I tried to forget about him. I didn't see him again during my shifts, and each day passed without incident. But deep down, I knew that the memory of his gaze, the sense of being watched, would linger long after I left that mall. It wasn't just a day in the life of a retail worker, it was a harrowing reminder of the darkness that sometimes lurks just out of sight. The feeling was echoed in my next job at Aldi. I had been working there for about a year when the real horror began. It was nighttime, close to closing, and only one other coworker, Joe, remained in the store with me. Joe had been there for years and had helped train me. The clock ticked down slowly as the fluorescent lights flickered above us, casting unsettling shadows across the aisles. As we finished stocking the last few items, a chill crept into the air. I felt a nagging sense of unease as I caught glimpses of movement from the corner of my eye. The store was quiet, save for the occasional sound of a cart rolling down the aisle, but it was the stillness that set my nerves on edge. Just then, the doorbell chimed, signaling a customer entering. Joe looked up, startled. "It's kind of late for a shopper," he muttered, his brow furrowing. I felt a knot form in my stomach as I watched the figure shuffle inside. It was a man, tall, with a hood obscuring his face. I felt a wave of déjà vu crash over me. The stranger walked slowly down the aisles, glancing at products but never seeming to stop. My heart raced as I exchanged worried glances with Joe. "Do you know him?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Joe shook his head, eyes narrowing as he watched the man. We continued our tasks, trying to shake off the feeling that something was terribly wrong. But as the man continued to linger, I felt a sense of foreboding settle over the store. Every so often, I would catch sight of him glancing in our direction, his posture tense, as if he was waiting for something. Then, without warning, he turned and headed toward us. Panic surged within me. "Joe, what do we do?" I whispered urgently. "Just stay calm," Joe replied, his voice steady. But the way his hands trembled gave away his unease. The man stopped in front of our counter, and I could see his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "You two work here late, huh?" he asked, his voice low and smooth, but with an unsettling edge. "Yeah, just finishing up," Joe replied, trying to maintain his composure. The man stepped closer, invading our personal space. "You should be careful," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "This place isn't safe at night." I could feel my pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" I managed to ask, my throat dry. "There are things that lurk in the shadows," he said, his gaze piercing. "Things that watch." At that moment, the air grew thick with tension. I glanced at Joe, and he met my gaze with a look of alarm. The man took a step back, a satisfied smile creeping onto his face. "Just remember," he said, backing away slowly, "you never know who's watching." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving a cold chill in the air behind him. I stood frozen, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the silence. As soon as the door swung shut, Joe let out a shaky breath. "What the hell was that?" he exclaimed, eyes wide with fear. "I don't know," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "But I don't like it." The feeling of being watched returned, heavier than before, as we hastily finished our work. The store felt claustrophobic, shadows stretching and shifting as the fluorescent lights flickered ominously overhead. Each sound echoed, reminding me of the man's unsettling presence. When the clock struck closing time, we locked the doors and hurriedly gathered our things. I could still feel that strange sense of foreboding lingering in the air, as if we weren't alone. As we walked to our cars, I glanced around, half expecting to see the man waiting in the darkness. That night, I bolted the door of my apartment, my heart still racing. The memory of the man's chilling words replayed in my mind. The world outside felt different now, tinged with a sense of danger I had never felt before. The shadows seemed to deepen, and every sound echoed like a warning. Days turned into weeks, and the memory of the man faded, but the feeling of being watched never fully left me. I remained on edge, hyper-aware of my surroundings. I thought I had escaped his gaze, but the darkness that lingered would stay with me, a constant reminder that sometimes the things that watch from the shadows are more than just figments of our imagination. My name is Jess, and this took place almost 10 years ago now, when I was working at McDonald's. It was a typical night, and I was wrapping up my shift, which started around 10 or 11 p.m. I had been working there for about 2 months, and during that time, things had been relatively quiet. The drive-thru had seen very few customers that night, and I was feeling a bit restless. Just when I thought it might be another uneventful evening, a car pulled in, the first one I had seen in at least 5 minutes. As the vehicle came to a stop at the intercom, I leaned forward, ready to take the order. However, instead of the usual greeting or request for a burger, a man's voice came through, asking, "Is this Jess speaking?" I was caught off guard. How did he know my name? My heart raced as I responded, "Why are you asking?" He replied calmly, saying he knew it was me and that he recognized my voice. I felt a chill run down my spine. I was nearly certain I didn't know him. I hesitated before asking if he intended to order anything, to which he simply paused and said, "I'll just see you later tonight." Then, without another word, he sped off through the drive-thru, leaving me utterly bewildered. I finished my shift shortly after that odd encounter, but the unsettling feeling lingered in the back of my mind. I drove home, a little under a 10-minute drive from the McDonald's, trying to shake off the strangeness of the evening. My neighborhood was typical, a quiet street with well-kept houses. However, as I pulled onto my street, I noticed a car parked in front of my driveway. It was positioned between my house and my neighbor's, and my heart sank. I quickly realized that it was the same car from the drive-thru. My instincts screamed that something was very wrong. I pulled into my driveway, and just as I did, the car engine roared to life and began to reverse, positioning itself in a way that completely blocked me in. Panic set in. I jumped out of my car, racing towards the front door of my house, praying it wouldn't be locked. When I reached the door, my worst fears materialized. It was locked. I started banging frantically on the door, trying to force it open, my keys buried deep in my pockets as panic clouded my thoughts. Every second felt like an eternity. Finally, after what felt like ages, my mom opened the door. I bolted inside, slammed it shut, and locked it behind me, my breath heavy with fear. I explained everything to my parents, and together we peeked outside to see that the car was still there, lurking ominously. My dad took a step outside, perhaps to confront the man or just to get a better look at him. As soon as he stepped out, the car sped off, disappearing into the night. Relief washed over me, but it was tinged with anxiety. What had just happened? The next day, I recounted the entire ordeal to my manager at McDonald's, hoping there would be some action taken, but he shook his head. Unfortunately, there wasn't much anyone could do. The car the man drove was completely ordinary, a black four-door sedan, perhaps 5 to 10 years old. Its typical appearance made it all the more sinister in my mind. To my relief, I never encountered the man again during my remaining time at McDonald's. However, the memory of that night would stay with me forever, a chilling reminder of how quickly a seemingly normal evening could turn into a nightmarish experience.